When you hear music like that, you know you've been to worship. When you come to church and hear a sermon, what do you usually remember? Do you remember most of the pearls of wisdom which drop from my lips as I articulate deep thoughts and impart great wisdom? Of course you don't. Rather, if you remember anything, you are most likely to remember a story or a joke. A story or a joke which will hopefully jolt your brain to recall what the gist of the overall message was. Well, one of the most brilliant communicators of all time was Jesus. And Jesus realized what I just observed. So he usually got across his message through the telling of stories which we call parables. Parables are metaphorical narratives which require the listener to work a bit in order to get something out of them. Their meanings tend to be somewhat hidden or disguised, and they usually appear to be far more innocuous than they really are. Parables are fictional stories which can use either fictional characters or historical characters to present their messages. There are two kinds of parables: example parables and challenge parables. Challenge parables can be especially controversial, even dangerous. As in Jesus' case, they can help get you crucified. Parables make people think. As with most stories, parables involve audience reaction and participation. They don't work nearly as well if the listeners don't get into it, even if only mentally and silently. Now, we read the parables of Jesus some 2,000 years after they were first uttered, and we miss some of the more subtle nuances which as listeners would have caught immediately. But just common sense should give us some idea of questions to be asked and assumptions to be drawn. We don't have to live in the time and culture of Jesus to at least pick up on some of the deliberate inconsistencies that he incorporated into his tale-telling. But at the same time, we must never forget that nothing he said was offered by accident. There was a purpose to everything his parables contained, including the seemingly foolish and or unfair. Let's take a look at 3 parables and see if I can better explain myself with examples. How about starting with the one about the hired hands? Jesus tells us that a landowner goes out very early one morning to find workers to harvest the produce of his vineyards. They agree upon the wage that they will earn, and he sets them to work. For whatever reason, he apparently wants to get in as much of the crop as possible, all in that one day. So he returns to the marketplace, finds other men standing around, hires them, agreeing to pay them whatever is right, and off they go. He repeats this action 3 more times, concluding with the hiring of the 5 o'clock shift. When evening comes, he gathers the workers and pays them for their labors, starting with the last hired and ending with the first hired. He pays them all the same amount of money. Imagine how well that sits with those who have worked the longest, those who, seeing what the last hired received, were really getting excited before he came down to them. Of course they complain. The landowner replies that he is not being unfair. After all, the first hired received what they had agreed to work for. Is it not his right to do whatever he wants with his money and be generous to those that he hired later if he so chooses? So what is your reaction? Obviously, Jesus is not here developing a new manual outlining employer-employee relations. Rather, he is telling his disciples and us about God's grace. We don't earn what we receive from God. It is given freely out of love and generosity. And there is another note that adds something to this equation. Remember how the parable has the landowner ask the men in the marketplace why they are standing around being idle. And they answer that nobody has hired them. It is not as if they are lazy or unwilling. Rather, they have not yet had a chance to work and produce. So perhaps the parable is also indicating that sometimes those with less chances and fewer talents need an extra boost. That those who are hired last because they are not as skilled and thus require more assistance to make it. That if the landowner represents God, those who came later to relationship with the divine are just as worthy as those who came earlier. Remember when you were a kid and chose up teams for games and sports? Someone always got picked last, usually the same someone, and invariably it was the least athletic, the least coordinated, the least competitive who filled that role. How hard it must have been to feel so unwanted. What an act of kindness it would have been to pick that kid first just once, but that never happened. After all, we were also kids and as such already reflecting how the real world works. But in this parable, Jesus is declaring that we should not begrudge the goodness that sometimes comes to others, even if we think that we should get more because we have been working for it harder and longer. And at the same time, he is taking a swipe at a social system which had built-in individual and structured injustice. A system where it was hard to get ahead, no matter how willing one was, because of who controlled that system and how it was ordered. Does such a system still exist, to at least some extent? Think about it. Now we come to a second parable. The master is going away on a trip. He gathers 3 of his servants and entrusts them with some money. One gets 5 talents, one gets 2 talents, one gets 1 talent. The parable doesn't tell us whether or not he gives them any instructions regarding these funds. Regardless, the first servant invests the money and doubles it, so does the second servant. But the man who was given 1 talent gets cold feet, remembering that the master could be a tough cookie, so he takes the safest course of action and buries what he is given. When the master returns, he demands an accounting. The first 2 servants inform him of their financial success, and after being praised, they are promoted to increased responsibilities. The third servant grudgingly admits that he was afraid, while accusing his master of being the kind who wants to get something for nothing, and so he stuck with what he received. So he stuck what he had received in a hole in the ground. Now the master really gets ticked. He calls this servant wicked and lazy, and he tells him that the least he could have done was give the money to lenders so that he would, if nothing else, receive some interest. And then he fires him. So what? Sounds like Donald Trump. So what, if anything, jumps out at you when you hear that story? My first reaction is to wonder a bit about this master. Do the servants know what he expects from them? And if so, why would the third servant not do more than just bury the loot? I also wonder what the master's reaction would have been if the first two servants had lost the money through bad investments. Would he have praised them for trying or condemned them for losing? Had they messed up, the third servant's actions might not have looked so bad after all. Also, there is an obvious error in the story, an error to an extent that Jews listening to Jesus would have instantly fallen over. That is the fact that according to Jewish law, again to an extent, money could not be lent with interest charged. So why in the world would the master berate his servant for not doing something illegal? This parable makes several points that were instructive for Jesus' listeners and should be for us as well. Surely the three servants do know what their employer expects of them when he entrusts the money to their care. The first two do what he wants them to do, while the third does not. The master wants them to make the most of what they have. And if the master represents God, then it is obvious Jesus is telling us to use whatever we possess, gifts from God, to its and our maximum potential. The gist of the parable indicates that had the first two failed, they would have still been praised because they tried. The third servant is timid and afraid. He fears failure and perhaps does not fully appreciate what he has been given and what could be done with it. And when his failure is revealed, he blames the master, labeling him as harsh. Perhaps in the mind of the third servant, every failure becomes someone else's fault. Do you know anyone like that? Remember, we have only the word of the unsuccessful servant that the master is a hard man. Beyond that, the parable presents life as it is, not as we might wish it to be. And the God which the servant calls harsh is really being just. He doesn't expect the one-talent man to be a five-talent man, but he does expect him to be the best one-talent man that he can possibly be. God wants a return on his investment, even if it's only interest. And here I should point out a bit of a correction regarding interest on loans, which was not totally forbidden in ancient Israel. Only interest on loans to poor people when they needed such money to survive. So there's also a justice issue here hinted at. Loans with interest were acceptable when they were part of a business transaction, but not when they imposed undue burdens on poor people in crisis. Doesn't that say something about lending a helping hand to those in need? Think about it. Let's end with one of the most familiar of Jesus' parables, that of the Good Samaritan. Here's one we all know. A Jew, possibly a merchant, travels from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on the way is ambushed by robbers who beat and strip him, after which they leave him for dead in the middle of the road. A priest comes along down the same route, sees the man, makes a wide circle to get by him, and continues on his way. Then a Levite, a member of the tribe responsible for the upkeep of the temple, does the same thing. Finally, along comes a Samaritan. Samaritans and Jews hated each other, even though they came from the same ethnic background and had very similar beliefs. They were like today's Sunni and Shiite Muslims. Anyhow, the Samaritan, unlike the Jewish religious leaders who preceded him, feels sorry for the victim of the attack, bandages his wounds, puts him on his donkey, and transports him to the nearest inn where he can better take care of him. The next day, since he has to leave, the Samaritan gives the innkeeper money to continue nursing the man and promises that when he returns, he will pay the innkeeper for any additional costs that he has incurred. The first question, which might have popped into the minds of Jesus' listeners, concerned why the merchant was traveling alone through what was undoubtedly known as robber-infested country. After all, he was probably not the first victim of such an attack. So why was he not journeying with a caravan, which is the way most merchants would have gone from place to place, in which there would have been safety in numbers? Of course, there's no answer given to that question. After all, this is a story, and besides, that question was never asked. The man did a foolish thing, but he paid a price which was undeserved. That would be a bit like blaming the victim, as so often happens today, for instance, in rape cases. She was dressed so provocatively, or what was she doing in that place at that time, or she was asking for trouble. We all make mistakes, but that doesn't make getting hurt by violators and brutalizers acceptable or right. A second question might make us wonder why in the parable Jesus picked on a priest and a Levite. Couldn't he just have said that a couple of fellow Jews passed the man by and accomplished the same purpose? I think he chose the priest and the Levite to make his point stronger. After all, they were the creme de la creme of Jewish society. People looked up to by other people as being better, and who were themselves convinced that that assessment was true. They thought they were better. They tended to be rather self-righteous and arrogant, sure of their own value and importance, and denigrating those that they considered to be beneath them. So their passing by of the wounded man, one of their own people, was even more horrible than if it had just been another Jew doing that passing by. Jesus' message here is that all people are children of the same God, a God who loves them. And this is a message that reminds me of all the times I have heard folks maintain that their faith is the only true and right religion, and that they, therefore, are the only ones that God loves and accepts. That seems to run counter to what Jesus is saying here, doesn't it? The Samaritan was a good man, a good person, and he helped his fellow men, even though that individual was seen to be his enemy. When I was reading this, I recalled the massacres in Paris last January, particularly the one that occurred in the kosher food market. The two Muslim terrorists attacked and killed Jews who worked and shopped in that market. And more would have been killed if a male Muslim employee there had not hidden them and saved them. I would suggest that he was a good Samaritan. We need more like him in a world that is so filled with hatred and violence. Are you like that? Think about it. When you leave here, you might not remember everything I just said, but you will remember the stories I repeated, the parables I shared, and I hope that you will think about what they mean.